No, thank you. No, thank you.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you. John is just too kind, and I know my wife is sitting here. My blessing, I count my blessings twice every day because she's in my life, and I know she has to be thinking, who is this person John is talking about? I have not met him before. And John, that was beyond eloquent, very gracious, and I'm very humbled by your words. I always thought you were jealous of my height, but I realize now, it's that vacation you never got, and so I apologize. What I meant by the barbershop, just in case, is it doesn't matter where you come from or how much you have. Black barbershop is usually the most democratic space in America. You got to wait in line. You got to wait your turn, and in the process, you'll hear conversations and you'll talk to people that you ordinarily wouldn't in any other circumstance, and you come to know each other. And kind of what Maya Angelou would say, that we're more alike than we're unalike, and we begin to see that and reflect that. Before I begin my presidential address, it's entitled Sam's Cottonfield Blues. I want to kind of give credit where credit is due. I had a number of people who helped me think about this manuscript and prepare it in this regard. And so I personally want to thank James Anderson, my mentor and advisor, my friend. I've known Jim Anderson for nearly 30 years. It's hard for me to call him Jim Anderson. I still call him Dr. Anderson, Professor Anderson in this sense. So I want to thank him personally for his read and feedback on the manuscript. The same is true of Vanessa Siddle Walker, just a near and dear colleague who's given me such guidance and support throughout the years. John, of course, who read it, gave me wonderful feedback in such a short amount of time, and I'm deeply gracious of that because I know how valuable our time is in this regard. Kimberly Ransom also gave it a critical read. Our past president, Yoon Pak, again, who gave it a wonderful critical read. Mary Calancis, the former dean in the College of Education. Michelle Purdy, Nathan Tanner, my new John Hale, doctoral student who I just love to death and love hanging around. And Marley Bunch, another one of my doctoral students who, Marley is probably the most exciting student I've ever had the privilege of working with. We did an independent study over the summer. She was supposed to just write a few pages. She damn near wrote a dissertation, and I couldn't keep up with her. So I finally told her, I said, "You got to stop. I need to go on vacation." So that was the first time in my life I ever pushed a student to stop writing, but she's pretty phenomenal, and she took the time to kind of read this address as well. Most importantly, I want to thank my wife and son. I know they have grown tired of hearing me read this manuscript or talk about this manuscript. It is deeply meaningful to me, but it wouldn't be here without them pushing me and asking questions and the patience that they have. And so I'm deeply indebted in this regard. The address, just so you know, John is right, there is a footnote within the footnote as to how to read this when it comes out. The address is going to be written in an autoethnographic way, and it's a storytelling tradition way. It does take a step off the beaten path of what we've seen in the past of presidential addresses, but nonetheless, it's a story I want to share. And it's a story I want to share of this as if the three people that I'm really talking about in this address are sitting right here in the front row. One of them never went to school a day in their life. Another only went to school for 3 years. Got a third grade education. And then the last actually earned a master's degree and went off to become a pretty phenomenal professor and poet in his own right. But all of them spoke within the vernacular of what it meant to come up of age in Mississippi. And so I wrote this address in that tradition. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and begin, and I hope I don't put you to sleep. So the title of the presidential address is Sam's Cottonfield Blues. So here we go. Family recalled him being smart, troublesome, inquisitive, wily, and charismatic. Short, wiry, thin, unusually strong, and handsome. He possessed a will and determination everyone admired, a child with an old soul and wit. Sam only attended school to about the third grade and never really learned much beyond a little reading, writing, and arithmetic. He was barely literate. Throughout childhood and adolescence, he boisterously bragged about his limited formal schooling, prideful ignorance, adults would say. But by today's educational standards, Sam would be labeled an elementary school dropout. Truth be told, labels were unnecessary. He was. Aside from a few questioning elders, no one cared enough to monitor his school attendance or hold Sam accountable, not even Sam. So he ditched school all the time because he just didn't like it. Decades later, as life repeatedly tested him as an adult, Sam's limited learning served as a stinging reminder of lost opportunities and forced denials. It was one of his deepest regrets. Through it all, however, he always seemed to value education, passing its importance on to his children and grandchildren. Almost all of Sam's schooling occurred outside of school. Experience was his best teacher. Knowledge came from long, intense conversations with elders, family and friends, from unnecessary and sometimes unavoidable encounters and skirmishes with bigots, from self-immersions into the unknown, trial and error, and failure, lots of failure. Before age 10, he convinced himself that more could be learned and gained from experiences outside school than in it, so Sam quit going to school altogether. Many factors pushed and pulled Sam out of school. Disinterest, poverty, and life circumstances were the biggest. He lived in a time and a place where black boys and girls were still expected to labor in cotton fields rather than attend school during daylight hours, a requirement during slavery that transitioned almost undisturbed well beyond emancipation into the mid-20th century. They were expected to sharecrop and work as domestics as soon as they came of age, sometimes to help family make the ends almost meet. So Sam helped out. He quit school and he started picking cotton, and he wasn't alone. Added young hands plucking at white fibers in bowls from August to November meant heavier bales weighed at sundown. When it came time to settle up with white landowners at year's end, it meant the possibility of a little extra family income, some pocket money, a better Christmas, or a clearing of a debt. For young black children in Sam's situation, schooling inconveniently coincided with the cotton harvest. Generations of policies associated with slavery, segregation, and white expectations were other factors pulling Sam out of school and forcefully shoving him and his kind into cotton fields. Whites didn't have to know him personally to presume he'd pick cotton throughout his life. Everyone expected the young Sams of Mississippi to pick cotton. Everyone, particularly someone of Sam's profile. He was young, truant, hard-headed, restless, and black, albeit his skin color was more than enough to qualify him for picking cotton. Century-long laws and customs in Mississippi determined Sam was perfect for cotton fields or prison. Wasn't that why black folk were brought to Mississippi? To pick cotton? History books said so. Generations of Mississippi school children learned through their textbooks that blacks were perfectly suited for slave labor, particularly picking cotton. Fortunate for Sam, he missed these lessons. Playing hooky so much, he wasn't in school long enough to learn these historical facts and interpretations. Still, he intimately knew them. It wasn't something he needed to learn from a teacher or a school book. As far back as the stories went, every black person Sam knew or heard of picked cotton. Everyone. Even the black landowners or black escapees to the north he knew, at some point in their life, picked cotton. Had Sam skipped his early induction into sharecropping and decided to stay in school, going beyond the elementary grades were a long shot. In the late 1930s, when Sam was coming of age in Mississippi, few schools existed beyond the elementary grades for black children. Officials who revamped Mississippi's education system in the 1890s built it with the intent of black children replacing their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents in cotton fields. Of the state's 82 counties, less than a dozen provided education up to or beyond 8th grade for colored children. Schools were expected to train people for their occupational stations in adult life, and for Mississippi blacks, virtually all stations led them back to cotton fields. This was a far cry from the educational expectations formerly enslaved Mississippians had of literacy in schools following emancipation, which guided the language and drafting of the constitutional amendment and school laws that established Mississippi's first real public education system in the late 1860s. They envisioned a school system built to include them and their children would liberate the formerly enslaved from cotton, not educate them for it. Sam and his people were from Bolton, Clinton, and Jackson. The ancient earth and winding, twisting roads in Bolton and Clinton symbolically told the story of Black progress in the state. There wasn't much of it. A person could walk a mile, but because of all the twists and turns in the road, moving forward exhaustively felt like they'd walked 10. Sam knew of family and fellow Mississippians who walked these roads and escaped the Cottonfield exhaustion and heat associated with them. They creatively carved out their own paths and lives in places like New York City and Chicago. They appeared to travel the nation, even the world, without restriction. A restless Sam wanted their life and what they had. Otis, an uncle on his daddy's side, learned to use his hands to hard pluck at piano keys in juke joints rather than white fibers in cotton fields. After gaining mastery of the instrument, he became the piano man for McKinley Morganfield, far better known to his listeners as the Great Muddy Waters. His uncle Otis even formed his own blues band and thereafter became a solo artist. Sterling, a younger cousin on his mama's side, escaped the death spiral of sharecropping because of an overzealous auntie who paid for him to stay in school longer than anyone else in the family's history. So the story goes, a bootlegger aunt paid for him to attend Holy Ghost High School in Jackson. Holy Ghost was a small private Catholic school that prided itself on being an alternative to public education. It gave smart, ambitious Black children a safe space to learn, gain confidence, and obtain a rare possession, a high school diploma. It shielded them from the harsh realities of Cotton's vice-like grip. Sterling didn't fail them. He couldn't. He became the first in the family to not only attend and graduate high school, but college. He would go on to become a world-renowned poet and professor of English at a major university in Chicago. Sam knew alternatives to cotton picking existed, but he also knew he wasn't a musician or poet. He possessed neither artistic mastery or educational persistence to transcend and outmaneuver the trappings and tripwires of Jim Crow Mississippi. But he did possess something his uncle Otis, cousin Sterling, and virtually all other family members had: tenacious grit. Alongside manhood, he had mastered this by the age of 15. Sam epitomized the attributions ascribed in I'm a Man by Bo Diddley. It's as if the blues man and all the affirmations of manhood written in the song had Sam in mind. At least Sam thought so. He survived the loss of his father, immense childhood violence and hunger, and sharecropping all before the age of 15. That was a victory in itself. Like others, he trailblazed his own way out of Mississippi. Along the way, he found his life calling too. His passion and want for something more than a life of Cottonfield blues and denials led him to lead his people out of Mississippi and toward Chicago, Black America's mythic promised land. It led them to overpriced apartments and low-paying jobs, but it was better than cotton. Bo and Muddy's blues, blaring on Sam's car radio, reinforced his conviction to leave his ancestral home because he saw no future for him or his children beyond cotton. As if it wasn't already apparent, Sam loved the blues, especially recordings by Muddy Waters and B.B. King. Lyrics sung with gravelly voices with deep southern drawls and the rhythmic sounds of harmonicas and acoustic guitars stirred his soul. Had he witnessed Ma Rainey conveying an August Wilson production the blues as life's way of talking, Sam would have instinctively nodded in agreement. The blues resonated with him. They provided succinct recorded sound bites of Sam's biography. They strung together stories of his upbringings, experiences, aspirations, infatuations, and longings for kinfolk left down home. Sam loved the blues so much, it was sometimes hard to know which came first: Sam, the blues songs he loved, or Sam's imitation of them. Muddy and BB sang the story of his life. Just listen to the titles of some of their most famous songs strung together. How could they not be about Sam? A mannish boy, sometime tomcat, hoochie coochie man who just wanted to make love to every woman he met. a man-child in the promised land, rolling and tumbling because he can't be satisfied, who sometimes feels like going home when he got his mojo working, but it just won't work on the women he desired. A prodigal son and man who sometimes felt like nobody loved him but his mama, and she could be jiving too. Sam was the family's key to the highway, as Maddie would say. His motivations and actions led to his family's outmigration. It moved them away from cotton, sharecropping, and Jim Crow, and it fulfilled his grandmother's dream. Sterling loved Sam like a big brother. They were kinfolk. He affectionately wrote of Sam's genius and generosity in his poetry. Despite their divergent paths and age difference, they remained close throughout life. Rarely did they call each other by their birth names. Sam was Buster to Sterling, and Sterling was Little Bruh, like a little brother to Buster. Buster was the family's Moses or Harriet Tubman to Little Bruh. Buster left Mississippi in the early 1950s and repeatedly returned south to help family migrate north to places like Chicago, Little Bruh included. He brought him to Chicago in 1962 and his mama and sisters soon thereafter. Buster is vocabulary strength, Sterling wrote in one of his poems. He drained blood from his veins for his family, brought me north to Chicago first, he recalled, from dawn to midnight, from Mississippi through Tennessee, Kentucky, and Illinois' lower parts. Like a yo-yo master effortlessly orchestrating an orb up and down a string, Buster masterfully yo-yoed vehicles up and down the interstate highways of I-55 and I-57 to move family north. Him securing work as a long-haul driver helped. It gave him a vehicle and reason to be in and around Mississippi. And slowly but surely, more and more family hitched a ride in their dreams to his 18-wheeler and followed him north. The 12-plus hour rides allowed Buster time to catch up with family and friends, and it also gave him an opportunity to ease the minds of family unsure about leaving Mississippi and everything they knew behind. Buster understood their concerns. They reminded him of his first trip north. Sensing discomfort, maybe even regret, he tried to pass the time and lessen anxieties by telling family stories or self-effacing jokes. Or he turned the dial on his truck's radio to find a good blues channel he could hum to or sing. He had an uncanny ability and gift to make people feel welcomed and heard. The short, skinny, braggadocious, and charismatic child with very little schooling grew into a slightly taller, stout, and even more charismatic and handsome man. Family barely recognized him when he first returned home. Sam had grown up. But once he spoke and fired off a few jokes, they all knew Buster was home. He had a giant-sized persona that never let his height, size, poverty, or skin color bother him, and his personality was infectious. It pulled on people like gravity and placed him at the center of all things happening. He was a family man and a man of many families and possessed all the acumen of a seasoned leader or head of state. He was a quick-tempered and sometimes violent man when things didn't go his way, especially when he felt disrespected or that his family was under assault. Rarely did he show deference to anyone besides the apron-clad matriarchs that raised or cared for him. He was well-dressed and carried himself with dignity. He was a proud, loud-laughing, hard drinker. He was confident, funny, charming, and loving, sometimes too much and too often. Family said he was hopelessly optimistic, a people's first person, deeply empathic, and generous to a fault, and everyone loved him for it. Sam knew people. He learned to read them far better than he ever learned to read books. Decades of studying and tinkering with human behavior helped him understand people and how to engage them. He knew the worth of a smile. It diffused nonsense and created opportunities. So he always smiled and tried to make people smile. He knew the value of a well-timed joke or personal story. So he always tried to make people laugh when they felt like shouting or crying. Or he'd tell a story to change a person's mood. Usually the joke or story was so good, people struggled to forget it, and they'd laugh so hard that it brought them to tears. He was a great storyteller. Quote, had Buster lived in another era, end quote, Sterling wrote of his big play brother, quote, he is Homer or Chaucer or Shakespeare, end quote. And man, could that man lie. Not in the untruth sense, Sterling warned, quote, but in the exaggerated or tall tale genre, end quote. Give Buster a grain of sand, he jested, and cousin will tell you about the whole beach. Buster had a remarkable ability to translate all experiences through his voice. He learned this skill by listening to and mimicking his elders, particularly his grandmother, Miss Maddie. Miss Maddie was his mama's mama, and she shared her stories of Mississippi the way she learned them, by word of mouth. Sometimes she's told stories by night fires, like the olden days, or on family porch swings, or at dinner tables after a Sunday service. Part Chickasaw Indian, she spent her advanced years telling and retelling family stories of her people and how they came to Mississippi. Most ignored Miss Maddie or didn't care for what she had to say. Some even thought she might be a little senile because she talked about things few could understand. But Miss Maddie knew Mississippi. It was her home and all she'd known since her birth in the 1880s. Mississippi, a land and place where the soil is as rich and fertile as the river that gave the state its name, is long. A place where, if Miss Maddie was commissioned to retell or rewrite the state's history, the chapters she'd produce would be penned in inks of sweat, tears, blood, and mud. Her study would begin by telling readers of the arrival of wealthy and poor white men from the Atlantic states, from Maine to Georgia, with ambitions of generating more wealth or striking it rich through the unfortunate dealings, ventures, and trades of cotton and slaves. It would tell of wars with Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Natchez, Shawnee, and Creek people, of their land negotiations with Spaniards, and of the conquest, extermination, and forced out migration of native people for the land redistribution and settlement of ambitious slaveholding white people. Her book would articulate the frustrations and generations of poor whites who hated slavery almost as much as black folk, and for strikingly similar reasons, except one. Slavery kept them landless, impoverished, and ignorant, and they wanted something more for their children than simply a badge of whiteness. It would be replete with stories of how forced migrations, sales, and separations of enslaved people to and from Mississippi repeatedly destroyed families. Her volume would chronicle the birth of sorrow songs that evolved into the blues. It would tell of Africans still being imported and sold up the mouth of the Mississippi from the slaver markets in New Orleans to places like Natchez and Vicksburg and Jackson, only for them to be smuggled and resold up other rivers like Yazoo, Big Black, and Little Tallahatchie, even as late as the start of the Civil War. Her book would share stories of emancipation and hope, black codes and violence, Reconstruction and revenge, and freed people, bound in new ways to white people, white power, white land, and white cotton. Mississippi, a state full of troubled histories and troubled minds. With her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, Miss Maddie recounted the stories of her and their Mississippi. Those who listened carefully could begin piecing together the story and chronology of their family's past. Her methodology was primeval. It was a mix of spoken word history with long pauses, emotions, and tangential recollections. Put together, it all haphazardly hummed and translated into stories of human suffering and misery. It is important to explain how she made meaning of her memories in words. She didn't tell chronological histories corroborated by source material evidence. She told her histories through testimonials, situations, past and immediate happenings, and inherited memories. Coherency was never her concern. She always left it to her listeners to decipher meaning or decode what she shared. It was the best she could do without any formal training in the discipline of history. Miss Maddie saw history as a form of currency or capital to be deposited in the minds of her grandbabies. Some could argue her stories were counter-narratives to what a racist Mississippi wanted people to know about her, her people, and her kind. She wanted family to know something different than the idea that black people's sole purpose in Mississippi was to pick cotton for another person's profit. In no way did she think Mississippi could treat black folk right. She had never seen it. So she further assumed that schools were never going to teach her children and grandchildren right. That being said, she unofficially became the family's history teacher. To Buster, Little Bruh, and the others who sat and listened to her, Miss Maddie's stories were powerful. She was one of their greatest teachers, and she never attended school a day in her life. She spoke of the blues wailed by tired and swollen feet, broken hearts, and dispirited minds. She spoke of people who walked hundreds of miles from the Chesapeake and Carolinas in coffle gangs, chained behind ox carts. People forced to walk and traverse valleys and mountains from Virginia to Georgia, who chopped through thickets and forests in Kentucky and Tennessee, who survived snake bites and dysentery in swamps and marshes in Florida and Louisiana, and who meander man-made paths in South Carolina and Alabama, carved out by centuries of human activity. All so they can get to Mississippi, so they could pick cotton, slavery's final frontier. In her own words, Miss Maddie shares stories of how these enslaved migrants settled along and around rivers that came to define and codify white supremacy and black subjugation. She'd frighten young listeners with stories of how whites talking about needing extra money made enslaved folk hide their children or run away in the stealth of night in attempts to keep their families intact. She choked back tears as she shared how cotton ruined and killed black bodies and minds, how the changing colors of fields forced blacks to labor year-round their entire lives for another person's profit. Fields that start mud black in winter, but progressively turn green after seeding in early spring, then perfectly white midsummer, dull brown in late autumn, and then black again. Slavery may have ended, she'd say, but black folks' lifelong and lifeline bondage to cotton and its landowners carried on. Miss Maddie told these stories until her passing at the age of 103. Her summations of how vast white fields of cotton ruined millions of black lives while simultaneously benefiting millions of lives worldwide always hit home to her two grandbabies, Buster and Littlebro. They were stories of people denied everything because of enslavement, who started freedom with nothing but personal ambition, and who persistently fought off the intergenerational effects and harms of slavery, racism, segregation, debt, hunger, and wrenching, unrelenting violence. If one had to compress Miss Maddie's stories into a singular message, it would be, if you're black and the opportunity presented itself, leave Mississippi immediately. No school in America could teach Buster or Littlebro what they learned at Miss Maddie's knee or on her front porch, and both proved to be good listeners and students. They took their grandmother's advice and left Mississippi first chance they could, but beyond the sorrow and pain she shared, the cousins heard other messages that kept families together despite powerful effects continually prying and tearing them apart. Mississippi Blues share stories of both sorrow and jubilee, pain and empowerment, alongside the pain shared by Maddie, grandma for those unfamiliar with the term. The cousins heard other stories, the cousins heard stories of family, love, strength, and determination, stories of people who made a way out of no way. It was their people walking behind those ox carts from the Carolinas, who tussled with language, codes, and each other in the hopes of fitting into an angry, segregated white world, who had frequent private talks with Jesus, pleading with him for a little more comfort, support, and guidance in this life, and requests for remembrances and rewards in the next. Miss Maddie taught them the importance of being kind and available to kinfolk. Family protected family, she'd say. Sometimes it was all that one had. Forced migration and forced labor because of slavery's expansion continuously created new worlds and new realities and new families in the black community. Hell, slavery created Mississippi, at least its identity, and led to a civil war over its most coveted assets, cotton and slaves. The outgrowth of all this disruption and unpredictability was the establishment of an extensive kinship network throughout the slave South. You do know what I mean when I say kinship or kinfolk, right? You know, people who are your people, but who sometimes really aren't your people. You know what I mean? Kinfolk are people who are not always immediate family, but sometimes they're your last family. Initially, a patchwork of people bonded by common experience, most often pain, that united those born, taken, and left behind because of slavery. Kinfolk labored together in cotton fields and picked up or slowed down the pace of hoeing or picking to protect loved ones from the lash. They shared stories of empowerment and family old and new by night fires after a hard day of slave labor. Kinfolk sometimes got on your last nerves, but you couldn't stop loving them in their ways. They cared for one another's children, parents, and grandparents as if they were their own. Kinfolk consoled the grieving when loved ones died or were sold away. They cried at burials, gave testimonials of affirmation about the dead when immediate family were too shook to speak, shared and contributed what little they had, and reminded enslaved loved ones, especially those fed up and bitter with bondage in the Creator, that God and His moral judgment were just and final. Kinfolk were like patches of loose discarded cloth, gathered and assembled and sewn together to make a quilt of stability in a very unstable world. unconditional family that provided comfort, shelter, resources, protection, and love. A uniquely American tapestry, stitched together with threads and needles of pain, but interwoven and padded with love and displayed with affection. Black America's comfort blanket. Kinfolk were the primary reason Black people survived 25 decades of enslavement. Like the blues, it's another gift Blacks pioneered in America. Now, Kinfolk paid for Little Bruh's high school education and paved the way to his professorship in world travels. They mustered up the money for Buster to buy a one-way train ticket to Chicago in the hopes of saving his restless soul from Cottonfield's prison or worse. Kinfolk like Buster took family and friends north to escape Mississippi in their own Cottonfield blues. Miss Maddie incorporated these stories into her narrations and told them as stories of inspiration to the next generation of grandbabies who visited and sat by her side. I know, because I was one of them. When Miss Maddie spoke, I saw the grace and power Buster, my daddy, witnessed and told me about. She was a beautiful woman with a beautiful mind, speaking beautifully about her people. I only came to know and learn from her in the last half decade of her life. At this point, Miss Maddie could barely move and was confined to her bedroom. On visits, I tried not to stare too much at the woman my daddy bragged to me so much about on our long car rides to Hinds County. I didn't want to be rude. Her daughter, Miss Carrie, my great aunt, sat with Miss Maddie all day. She never left her side. Miss Carrie would scratch her mama's head with a thick black comb as she braided her long white hair. Miss Maddie loved to have her head scratched as she talked to her grandbabies. When she couldn't quite articulate what she had to say, Miss Carrie would whisper a few questions to her mama and then help her finish her thoughts. Whereas other grandchildren exhausted themselves with games of tag and sprint races outside, I sat with Miss Maddie until I was forced outside to play with kinfolk. Even as a preteen child, I preferred her stories over being grabbed, pulled, and wrestled to the ground by sweaty country cousins I barely knew. Her story spurred my curiosity and passion for history and desire to know how the past impacts the present. Studying Miss Maddie's histories and the history of her histories in the academy have proven difficult. How does one tell or write the histories of stories never written down or only heard as a child? How does one corroborate the reliability, accuracy of events, or competing claims of truth of the memories of both the teller and listener of these stories? The Academy in general dismiss her stories as folktales, but if you've studied the specifics of American history, more specifically the African American past, you know they are something more than family myths or legends. Making meaning of Miss Maddie's stories is kind of like studying and attempting to prove the existence of black holes. All kinds of evidence around the periphery or edges of black holes support claims of their existence, but nothing specific that unquestionably prove they're real. Until, of course, a photograph was recently taken of a black hole that finally captures what a century of theories and scientific evidence had already proven. Humanity, at least outside of scientific communities, needed a photograph to believe not only that black holes are real, but that they reside at the center of every galaxy. The photograph not only confirms their presence, it also validates century-long research acknowledging their immense gravitational force and how black holes define the character and movement of all things known and unknown in the visible universe. The same is true of black folk in the history of the United States, especially in Mississippi. Their people, lived experiences, and stories are at the center of everything that made America, and by default, Mississippi, great. Everything. Centuries of theories, histories, and evidence show their evidence, contributions, and gifts, but they have not been captured in a way acceptable to the general public, even though countless photographs exist as proof. Society has yet to accept the centeredness and immense gravitational impact African Americans have had on the making of America and its people. At the center of all things known and unknown in this country are black people. Everything. Considerations of how to treat and include people of African descent since their arrival in 1619, 400 plus years ago, are at the center of how American society came to define its norms, values, beliefs, policies, people, institutions, economics, and innovations. Even the very definition of freedom stems from the treatment of Black people at the time of the drafting of two of this nation's most important documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Miss Maddie knew the realities of this centeredness theory all too well. She was essentially the family's Stephen Hawking, someone who developed years of deep thought, knowledge, and evidence to support her claims, but without possession of a definitive photograph to prove them. Her evidence was a century of stories and experiences, stories that started with her daddy and her daddy's people and kinfolk, formerly enslaved people and their children who shared their life experiences, their histories with and around her when she was a child. Miss Maddie sat and listened and absorbed and made meaning of the knowledge they shared. She methodically and meticulously tried to pass it on to others in the hopes they too would listen and pass it on further. She was the culmination of intergenerational knowledge, amassed, processed, and passed on for a future generation of listeners and storytellers to absorb, build upon, and share. Thank God, a few listened and shared, and I am here today presenting in this venue and on this platform to pass on the knowledge and wisdom she shared. Her stories shape the histories I write. They guide my weary mind and pen when I feel like giving up or researching and writing a different kind of history. It pains me to share as a tenured professor of education and history at a major university, the second in the family to become a professor, the first on my daddy's side, that my memories of Miss Maddie's memories are just as fragmented as the stories she told. At best, I share stories of her stories as told to me by my late father, Samuel Spann, Buster, our cousin, Sterling Plump, Little Bruh, and the last living family, kinfolk of their generation. I was a teenager when Miss Maddie died. I was less than 2 months shy of being 17 years old when my daddy died. He beat cotton, but he couldn't beat cancer. He was 58 years old when Jesus, as the blues singer Mississippi Fred McDowell wailed and moaned, made up his dying bed. I entered adulthood in the academy determined to find a way to tell their stories and lived experiences the way they expressed them to me, unapologetically. I haven't as of yet. I have written a number of histories on the African American experience, most specifically of the educational experience of formerly enslaved Mississippians, but I've yet to tell and write the history of my Mississippi people. This is the first step in a long struggle to do so. The structures of the academy, the rules of evidence and academic research and writing, and my own personal hesitancies have simply kept me from writing this narrative. But the more I research this aspect of my past, the more I realize the attention, structure, and voice it needs, and more importantly, deserves. Sam's Cottonfield blues were uniquely his, but a million more Sams await discovery, research, and articulation. Together, they tell the story of how cotton impacted and defined people's lives, how it led to their out-migrations, how it kept mothers and grandmothers attentive to the ways their babies and grandbabies were being taught and treated, how it made them truth-sayers and family teachers like Miss Maddie. Still, my personal hesitancies beyond the academy come with a strange and uncomfortable acknowledgement. Ironically, the pressures Cotton put on my dad to leave Mississippi created the conditions for me to come into this world. It made me. Without Cotton, there is no restlessness, out-migration, courting of a white Indiana girl, or birth of their biracial child who would be the first in his family to earn a doctorate and write a history about Mississippi cotton fields and schoolhouses. It's hard to concede, but without cotton and all the strife and challenges associated with it, there's no me. It's taken me 25 years to draft the beginnings of a history family has asked me to write. I promise it won't take me 25 years to finish it. I will no longer fight with my academic mind over questions of what constitutes objectivity or whether the inclusion of the personal should be in historical research and writing. Just as I have used the tools I've learned and honed as a historian to write the educational history of African Americans in general, I will do the same for the lived experiences of the people who made me, me. I will fulfill a kinfolk request and do as Cousin Sterling asked of me at a party celebrating the completion and earning of my doctorate. He gifted me a 3-page poem he wrote about my father and our people, in which he affectionately entitled Cousin, and beseeched upon me a call of action. As I glanced deeply at the poem that sketched together meaning, attributions, and names of our family's past, Sterling cleared his throat loud enough to break my focus and shift my attention toward him. When we made eye contact, he spoke firmly but softly a few words I don't think I will ever forget. He said, "Chronicler, chronicle our history." "I will, cousin. Kinfolk promise." "I will." Thank you.